This is the first of our drop-ins for 2022. And we had several last year that were really exciting and really successful. And the format is a public meeting, a public square. That's the underlying philosophy of free speech champions, to build the public sphere and try and reimagine it in different ways in light of the changing way in which we interact and communicate, the digital world. And in this one, Origins of COVID-19, Science, Skepticism and Free Speech, it might feel that world events have taken over to some extent, and as particularly in the England, we're coming out of the pandemic and removing restrictions, it might feel that, oh, are we looking back? But actually, I don't think so. I think we had 2 years of such an unprecedented and far-reaching, many far-reaching decisions that were made. I think it's really important to reflect on what we did, why we did it, what impact that had on freedom of speech, on freedom more broadly, and how we really go forward and learn the lessons of that period in our history. So I'll just start off with a brief introduction, and then I will say a bit of house rules, and then we will get straight into it. So in the past 2 years, we have faced a global pandemic and had to reckon with an unprecedented government intervention into our lives, while disagreement about how to respond to the pandemic was widespread. Many liberal democracies took steps to censor, shut down and demonize dissent. The scientific establishment initially dismissed the now seemingly reasonable lab leak hypothesis and smeared its proponents, despite some of the very same top scientists privately believing it to be credible. Science has steered us through the crisis and created life-saving vaccines, but some might argue that it's also let us down in some instances, arguably betraying some of its fundamental ideals, free inquiry and open debate. The pandemic has stimulated some difficult questions then. Where is the line between skepticism and misinformation? What role should science and expertise play in the public debate? Has science become politicized? And is the scientific establishment open and critical enough? And at the heart of all of these questions, what role does, or what role should, free speech and free inquiry play in science itself, given that science has often upset orthodoxies and been suppressed for its daring forays into forbidden territory? So I am very delighted, excited to be joined by an esteemed panelist to engage with these questions with me and us all together in this evening's event. So we are joined by science writer, journalist and businessman Matt Ridley to hash out some of these issues, and a particular focus on the lab leak controversy in light of his new book, which is examining the origins of COVID-19, and it's called Viral: The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. So thank you so much, Matt Ridley, for joining us and taking some time out of your evening to speak to us this evening. And before we just get straight into it, as I said at the beginning, this is a discussion format, and we're having a slightly different format tonight, where we want people to interject, to intervene, to contribute questions. So I'm going to start off with asking Matt a few questions first, and then please raise your hand, I'll come to you. And even if it's completely left field, please ask questions and also make some statements and your thoughts on what has happened over the last 2 years, the implications it's had for freedom. And just slightly off that tangent, I mean, Nilu, who is a co-host tonight, she's in Canada and lives in Canada, and there's been many discussions in Canada about the truckers and the kind of response to that, whether or not we need new labels for liberal leaders taking seemingly illiberal stances on things. So what does all of this mean, and what does the last 2 years mean for freedom? So I'm going to just start off with a broadly open question to you, Matt, firstly. I mean, why do you think we reacted to the way we did about the lab leak hypothesis? And actually just describe to us what you think happened and what the reaction was to that hypothesis, and why do you think it happened that way?
Yeah, well, thank you, Inaya, and it's great to be with you, and thanks for the question. And I think it's worth saying at the outset, we don't know how the pandemic began. And that's pretty shocking. We've got fantastic technology, fantastic science. We ought to be able to know by now. And the main reason we don't know is because it happened in an authoritarian country which hasn't been sharing information properly with us. There's some evidence, which has been found a bit this week, that they've been less than truthful with us about what happened in the market, that seafood market, which was originally thought to be where the spread happened. They are saying, no, none of the animals tested positive in that market. There's a couple of papers out this week saying, well, hang on, we think there were susceptible animals in the market, even if we don't know whether they were infected. Likewise, there was very little information about what was going on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan, the most prominent lab for studying SARS-like coronaviruses in the world, which happened to have the closest relative of this virus in its freezer, but had brought it from a long way away to that city. So right from the outset, it was perfectly reasonable to say which of these two possibilities is more likely. And right from the outset, the Chinese authorities wanted us to rule out the lab leak completely. And the Western scientific establishment went along with that. We now know that at a meeting on the 1st of February 2020, the senior scientists on both sides of the Atlantic met online, about 15 of them, and agreed that what they'd seen of the genome of this virus made them very worried that it might have been one of the ones that had been studied in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. One of them said he was 80% sure that was the case. One of them said 60 to 70. One of them said 50%. We know this because their emails have leaked. And we've finally seen what they were thinking. But they came together and drafted 2 papers 3 days later saying they could rule out that possibility altogether, the possibility of a laboratory leak. And the rest of the scientific journals, the newspapers, the media, and most politicians, including initially myself, fell in line with that. And I remember in March and April saying to people who would ring me up and say, you understand genomics a bit, is it true that this thing came out of a lab? And I would say, no, there's 2 very sound scientific papers saying it's nonsense, it didn't come out of a lab, it couldn't possibly have done. Don't worry your pretty little head, my friend, with that idea. I wasn't quite that patronizing, but, there's an element of that. And, Facebook wouldn't let you discuss the possibility at all for about a year. The New York Times labeled it debunked if it was ever mentioned, and so on. This was not freedom of expression, and this was in the West. This wasn't because the Chinese were saying it. Now, why did that happen? Why was this omerta on discussing a lab leak? And the middle of 2021, that changed, and we were allowed to discuss it. There's a big fight back at the moment trying to shut it down again. But Alina Chan and I have written this book, think it's still an open question, and we will eventually find out. Why did it happen? There were political reasons. There's no doubt about that. It would have been a gift to Donald Trump, and an awful lot of people didn't want Donald Trump to have any gifts. It would have possibly damaged relations with China, and that was a worry to people, what the impact of that might have been. And it would have possibly damaged the reputation of science. Now, I've got some sympathy for that. I'm the most pro-science person I know. I think it's humanity's greatest achievement, bar none. But I also think that if science closes ranks and say we never do anything wrong and we don't need investigation when something like this happens, then they risk tainting the whole of science and not just 1 or 2 slightly over the top virology experiments. And they risk pushing me into the same camp as some anti-GMO activists who I've campaigned against for years. And I find myself now on the same side as 1 or 2 of these people, demanding access to information about what was going on in laboratories. And that's a very uncomfortable position. Why should I be? I'm pro-science. And yet, because of the lack of free speech and free conversation. But I think there's another reason too, and that's just that there is this mindset, and we've seen it in other aspects of the pandemic, which wants to declare a premature consensus, which wants to say, this is a received truth, and you guys better believe it. The received truth was that masks are useless, and then the received truth was that masks are perfect. I think neither is true. I think masks probably help, but I don't think the evidence is very good that they do. Likewise, I thought maybe the lockdown was necessary. I now, looking back on it, think, well, lockdowns only work if you're going to eliminate the virus. As soon as you realize you can't eliminate it, lockdowns were a devastatingly bad policy. But, you know, at every stage, we needed to admit that there wasn't a perfect answer. Science isn't the 10 commandments. It's operating in uncertainty.
Mm. And on that point that you made about, for example, worried about damaging relations with China, and people didn't want to hand, Trump a win, given that he was saying the China virus and all these types of things. But, I guess that the criticism would be, is that not the fact that science is becoming too tied up with politics? Because realistically, if it's about the pursuit of truth and trying and testing an open inquiry, why should that matter at all? I mean, if the scientific papers and magazines and journals are just condemning things before even looking at them, then isn't that really just completely counter to what science is? Has it become too fused with political interests?
Well, I'm afraid I think it has. I've been very disillusioned by this episode, and one or two others as well. I still think science is humanity's greatest achievement as a philosophy, but as an institution, I think it's got a lot wrong with it. It's very much got this herd mentality. It's got this rather patronizing view of the public that they're too stupid to understand stuff and they must be told what to think. And it's got this surprisingly political angle. Many and most scientists do have strong political views. They tend to be very top-down ones, interestingly. They think the world is run by governments rather than by people, as it were. And governments are, corks bobbing on the waves, like people like me think. So there does seem to have been a politicization. And this question of whether the virus might have come out of a lab, there is no doubt at all, even from reading those emails, that in early February, those scientists who rapidly changed their minds and said they could rule it out were being motivated at least partly by politics. The politics of science funding, the politics of cooperating with the Chinese, the politics of not being on the same side as Donald Trump. And I think that's always been true. When Newton was arguing with Leibniz, there was a lot of politics involved in that. There was a big row about the discovery of Neptune between Britain and France in the 1850s. It very nearly led to war. So politics and science have got entangled all along. But at its best, science resists that. And it does so by not being united. It's very important that science doesn't form a united front, that there's always Professor X, who's an awkward so-and-so in some obscure corner of the world, who says, hang on a minute, I don't think your sums add up. I don't think the sun is going around the earth. I think the earth might be going around the sun, or whatever.
But what I guess from the devil's advocate here, I mean, some people would say that in some senses that the pandemic was almost a kind of wartime effort. People were trying to frame it as that. And actually, it wasn't the time when people needed dissent. We needed people to comply, to fall in line, because there was a threat that was people didn't really know about, that was killing people, and they didn't know the scale and how dangerous it was. And, people, in some corners of the internet spreading, theories here that are unverifiable, other people countering all of the government advice would cause a kind of fragmentation that would make it less likely to be able to have a coherent national response that everyone complies with. And so I guess the argument is that I guess we can deal with all of the freedom questions later, but right now we've got a virus in front of us that we don't know, and we just need everyone to shut up and follow.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the idea that the pandemic was caused by the 5G phone network is a very, very stupid, annoying, and somewhat dangerous idea. But I don't think the answer is to censor it, to ban it. I think the answer is to attack it, to ridicule it, to reason with it. And there's plenty of other ideas that are less foolish than that, but I think are wrong. But I don't want them censored. I think that's dangerous. I think it's counterproductive. I think the first thing you do to people, if you tell them they're not allowed to think something, is drive up their suspicions that something's up, that Bill Gates really is injecting microchips into our arms, or whatever it might be. The idea that just because there's a global emergency on, we must abandon free speech and be a liberal, can't be right. It has to be wrong. Yes, war is to some extent different, but this wasn't war. I mean, what's going on now is war, but that's not the same. And even there, look in Ukraine, what we need is truth, because truth is on President Zelensky's side and not on President Putin's side. It feels to me like we're grown-ups and we should be allowed to have conversations about things.
And Matt, how do you think it's got to this point? I mean, is this a kind of long-standing thing that's happened over a long time, or has it always been there, or was there something specific about the 2020 situation that made this type of response more likely? Because some people have said that that the kind of pandemic accelerated pre-existing trends of big tech power and censorship and a kind of technocratic response on the part of governments and so on. I mean, what do you think? Do you think this is, why do you think this happened?
Well, as you probably know, Inaya, I'm not a great fan of golden age arguments, that it was better in the past and it's worse now. I wrote a whole book saying it's better than it's ever been and it's going to get better still. But you're looking back on the 1990s and early 2000s, when suddenly on the internet, you could wander freely and find people saying things and go behind the filter of the mainstream media and get in touch with slightly obscure stuff that they weren't telling you and make up your own mind and find out each other's point of view. That does begin to feel like a bit of a golden age, even though it's only 20 years ago. Compared with now, when the online lynch mob descends on you if you don't think the right thing, when as a result you self-censor, when the echo chamber leads to you sort of going further and further down the rabbit hole of your own opinions, and where things get very, very polarized. And at the same time, as you say, something seems to have led us to put technocracy in charge rather more than it used to be. So I do think it's a slightly dangerous moment in human history. We're not at the end of the Roman Empire and descending into the Dark Ages, I think. But the Enlightenment does feel more under threat from the culture war for a start than I ever expected to see in my lifetime. And I think we've got to tame the technology that we've unleashed. I mean, when the printing press came into existence, it was wonderful for the world because suddenly, anyone can buy a book, anyone can read the Bible, anyone can, know what other people are thinking. But it did lead to the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the Inquisition, and a lot of nasties. When radio came along, suddenly we can all listen to each other and hear each other's point of view. But boy, did the dictators make use of radio to hot up their supporters and drive people into prejudice. And I think we're in a similar technology-driven crisis here that we'll have to overcome, as we did those other two crises, by taming the technology.
Mm. And what would you say to those that say that, you know, by and large, yes, there was probably a bit of overreach. You know, some people were censored, that this theory was suppressed, but, you know, we've got the vaccines, you know, in the end, you know, we're coming out now, and maybe we can learn the lessons and perhaps not make the mistake again. So perhaps in the grand scheme of things, it's not been, there's been a bit of overreach, but overall we've kind of muddled through.
I would get very cross if you said that to me. Sorry, I didn't mean to. I would get cross with you, but because I would say, look, between 5 and 15 million people are dead, and you don't want to find out why. If 60,000 airliners had crashed, and you said, well, let's not look at the black box, you'd get quite cross, wouldn't you? We need to know why, to honor their memory, to stop it happening again. I mean, the whole point of sharing the information from a black box, you know, the whole point of the Boeing 737 MAX scandal is that eventually, far too late, we found out that there was an unsafe airplane in the sky. And the world found out, and it wasn't covered up. Well, there might be unsafe practices going on in laboratories or markets, and we need to know which, because we need to not do them in future and not have another of these pandemics, which might involve a more deadly virus next time. So it feels to me absolutely vital that the question of the origin of this pandemic, which, as I say, almost uniquely among recent epidemics of emerging viruses, we don't know the origin, even though we've got superior technology than we used to have. It feels to me absolutely vital that we find that out. Because there's another reason too. If you were Kim Jong-un or the head of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, you would watch this episode and think, my goodness, I could do a lot of harm with a highly infectious virus. It doesn't even have to be very deadly. As long as it's very transmissible, I can turn the world economy upside down and mess people up. And I probably wouldn't even get the blame, because the World Health Organization would send in a team and say, no, nothing to see here. We don't really know how it started. We've given up trying. We're being very slow about looking at it. So for me, it's a really important question.
Mm. And just finally, before we open it up to the floor, I mean, you know, there's big, broader questions being discussed in society right now about, you know, the shifting balance of power internationally. I mean, do you think that, you know, we are in a position to really even find out the truth of this, you know, with, you know, China being so closed, and also a general reluctance within Western societies to be very authoritative domestically when it comes to questions of freedom? You know, we saw big debates in relation to the kind of Joe Rogan podcast, and also the kind of truckers in Canada. I mean, do you think that there is an interest and will to be able to advocate for freedom and also find out the origins of COVID?
Well, I have to say, I'm pretty shocked by how erstwhile libertarians have rather enjoyed, is probably the wrong word, but have rather indulged their taste for draconian authoritarian rules, bypassing democratic systems. And I mean, I said this when I was in Parliament, which I no longer am. You know, when we were legislating on whether or not a Scotch egg was a meal. Okay, at one point in Britain, because, you know, you were allowed in a pub, but only if you had a substantive meal. And so that, you know, the question was, is a Scotch egg a meal? And somebody's trying to write down rules about what a meal is. You know, when you get to the point where government is trying to tell you things like that, something's gone horribly wrong, and there are people enjoying too much power. Maybe enjoying is the wrong word, but flexing too much power. But back to the first part of your question about whether we'll ever find out, because China is such a closed society. Again, I had a conversation quite early with a very senior scientist who said, oh, but Matt, you know, you say that these scientists have been secretive in China. Well, of course they've been secretive. It's a communist regime. What do you expect? To which I said, well, how is that supposed to reassure me? I mean, why do we just accept these things? Why can't we be critical of them? If this pandemic had begun in, let's say Cambodia, a relatively small country without much influence in the world, I'm pretty sure the world would have insisted on knowing exactly what had gone on and finding out the details. I think if it had happened in a big but more open country like Japan, I think we'd have very quickly done that. In 2007, there was an outbreak of foot and mouth disease on a farm in Surrey, just a few miles from the leading global reference laboratory for studying foot and mouth disease at a place called Pirbright. Britain didn't, prevent anyone investigating, say there was nothing to see here. Immediately and openly, everybody was trying to work out whether or not there was a connection. And indeed there was. A leaking pipe at the factory had been mended by a contractor who'd gone straight to the farm, etc. So I don't think we should let China off the hook here. It's a country with a very despotic and tyrannical regime. Its instinct in the first SARS epidemic and again in this one has been to be as little transparent as possible, and that is not the way to prevent the next pandemic.
Thank you, Matt. So we're going to open it up to the floor, and hopefully we've started with some provocations and some thoughts, and regardless of what perspective you come from, please feel free to ask any questions about this subject matter. So firstly, we're going to go to Daniel.
Hello, thank you. Well, I'm going to just ask perhaps a slightly more philosophical question. I was wondering if you could say a few words about the role of free speech or free inquiry in science as an ideal, as a sort of general philosophical guiding point, and perhaps nominate some moments from the history of science that you think that was science at its best, as you said earlier, ploughing on against the orthodoxy or in spite of great pressure.
Yes.
And then to look to the future, how can science recover that reputation, if it can recover that? And thirdly, which you may not have time to get into, but I'm quite interested to hear a little bit about, in very basic terms, the evidence for the lab leak hypothesis, or if you could get into some of that a little bit, that'd be interesting, at least to me.
Yeah, only a small topic there, but yeah, I mean, just cast your mind back to 1953. Fun enough, 69 years ago this week, two scientists, Watson and Crick, saw something that was extraordinarily important. I think the most important scientific discovery of all time. They basically suddenly saw that life was a digital three-dimensional code called DNA, and that was a very surprising discovery. They were pushing against the orthodoxy at the time. Everybody thought that genes were made of proteins. At least not everybody, but most people. There were a few unorthodox people who thought it was DNA. Most people thought that the structure of DNA wouldn't tell you anything. Quite a lot of people thought that the answer would lie in quantum physics or some weird extra kind of new way in which the world works. Almost nobody thought it was just digital information. When they made their discovery, nobody in the world of biochemistry invited them to speak about it. They were dismissed as nutters who'd come up with a wacky theory, etc. Now, because there's no great politics involved, that didn't prevent them winning out in the end, and we all now know they were absolutely right. They had pinched some crucial data off their rivals at King's College, particularly Rosalind Franklin and Ray Gosling, and that was kind of naughty, but they were in competition with them and didn't want their other rival, Linus Pauling, to get there first. That's there's some unsavory aspects to that competition. But my point is, here's an open, free, slightly heretical idea bursting through in a relatively open and competitive and free situation. That's science at its best. And even there are people saying, don't you dare meddle in this. This isn't the topic you're supposed to be studying, and all that kind of thing. How much worse it is when you're dealing with something more political, that challenges orthodoxies in religion more, etc., etc. Well, we all know the stories of Galileo and Darwin and all that kind of thing. How do we get science to do that? I think it's relatively simple. I think that what science needs to do is to be very decentralized, so that Professor A spends a huge amount of his energy trying to prove that Professor B is talking nonsense, instead of Professor A and Professor B signing up to a consensus view of the world that excludes everybody. Actually, it's the free competition of ideas that works here. And in recent years, because of the centralization of funding, so everybody's getting a grant from Anthony Fauci or Jeremy Farrar at the Wellcome Trust. So they know that when one of those two people pronounces a particular point of view, that they would be wise not to argue against that. And they also know, because of the way government funds come, that you've got to specify what you're going to discover before you even start the project, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the over-centralization and the over-consensus-driven nature of science is what we need to challenge.
Fantastic. And Harry McKenna?
Hi, thanks for your time, Matt. So I was just wanting to firstly ask you about the issue of people censoring the lab leak theory because of Trump. So I think you mentioned that people didn't want to acknowledge or investigate the lab leak theory because they were afraid of giving a gift to Trump. But do you also think there's an element of them being afraid they'll be accused of racism if they embrace the lab leak theory or investigate it? Because Trump was one of the first world leaders, one of the first prominent people to, advocate this theory, and he started calling it the Wuhan virus. And Twitter and Facebook censored it because they thought it was untrue, but also because they thought it was, spreading racism. And for a time I saw, a number of media outlets and some of my own friends on social media saying that anyone who spreads this it's like a racist conspiracy theory. So I was wondering what you thought about this idea very early on in the pandemic, that the lab leak theory is, inherently racist in nature, towards, racist nature. Also, you briefly mentioned the World Health Organization, and I was wondering what there was accusations about the World Health Organization helping China to cover up the severity of the virus in the early stages. So I was wondering, do you think it brings the WHO into disrepute?
Two very good questions. And on the racism point, there are only two really plausible routes by which this virus got into the human population from horseshoe bats. One is via the food trade in a market, smugglers with other animals that got infected by bats, probably, or a person who was eating bats directly, even possibly. Or the alternative, which is that it was scientists studying those bats and their viruses and bringing them to Wuhan, that was the cause, which we know was happening. I don't see why one is more racist than the other. I don't think either of them is racist. If handled properly, I mean, you can express it in ways that are racist. And frankly, a lot of what was said in the first couple of months about Chinese practices with respect to what they eat in terms of what's for sale in wildlife markets, and also their practices with respect to traditional Chinese medicine, were, if anything, more racist than saying, hang on, I think some perfectly respectable virologists have been doing some experiments that probably aren't that safe, with funding from America and support and collaboration with Americans. And, you know, my co-author on this book, Alina Chan, is Canadian. She's not Chinese, but she is of Chinese ancestry. And she is very offended when people say the reason you're pursuing the origin of this virus is because you've got some kind of vendetta against Oriental people. You know, she says, I am one. So in fact, she was then accused by some of sort of race treachery, which is an even more racist thing to say, in my view. So I have no, I just don't see that it's more racist to think it might have come out of a laboratory than to think it might have come out of a Chinese market. As for the World Health Organization, there is no doubt that they gave false reassurance in January 2020 when they said it wasn't spreading human to human, that the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, went to Beijing, saw Xi Jinping, and came back and said, words cannot express my admiration for his transparency in this pandemic. This was at a time when people were being punished and locked up for talking about it in Wuhan, when crucial information about what was going on was not being shared with the rest of the world. So that was the beginning of what, in my view, was a shocking performance by the World Health Organization. Over the next year, they set up an inquiry into what might have happened to start the pandemic. They took a year to organize it. They allowed the Chinese to decide who was on it. They went to China, where their itinerary was determined by the Chinese authorities, and they gave a press conference that was dominated by a ludicrous theory that had come into China on frozen food from abroad, and throughout that time, I was badgering the British government, saying we ought to be using our great biomedical expertise in this country to try and understand the origin of this pandemic. And I was always told, we're leaving it to the WHO. So the very fact that the WHO was screwing up means that it was worse than screwing up. It was counterproductive. It was getting in the way of proper investigations that could have found out stuff when the trail was slightly less cold than it was now. So I'm afraid I'm not going to dissemble here. I think the World Health Organization has damaged its reputation significantly during this episode.
Sam?
Hi, thanks, Matt, for everything so far. Correct me if I'm paraphrasing badly, but I think you're talking about how we kind of need more truth these days. And then you spoke about Ukraine briefly, about how President Zelensky is on the more right side of truth than President Putin is. I'm just wondering, is the problem these days that truth has become so subjective that an objective truth, as much as we might desire it, just perhaps isn't out there? I mean, I was drawn to thinking about Ukraine because that's what you were talking about, you know, take the Snake Island stuff, how we've seen in the last 24 hours, I think, that actually the Ukrainian side were, you know, indulging in propaganda by reporting that all 13 inhabitants, defenders of this island, were killed, when in fact they've been proven to be alive and surrendered and taken prisoner. So yeah, I was just wondering, Matt, if you could speak a little bit about objective truth and whether there's actually that much of an appetite for it, given that we do seem to be increasingly pushed into our own subjective ideals.
Well, I think, I mean, of course, you're right that there are appalling untruths told in war on both sides, and truth is the first casualty and all that. And so, yes, I'm not here to say that everything the Ukrainians say is right and everything the Russians say is wrong. But I think in general, the Ukrainians have more interest in telling us what's actually going on in Ukraine than the Russians do, and that is reflected in their media. As for the value of objective truth, I'm pretty old-fashioned here. I genuinely think there are things that are true and things that are false, and I think the notion that the postmodernist notion that has spread from academia in the last few decades, that there is no such thing as truth. There is my truth and there is your truth and things like it's all subjective. I think is thoroughly anti-rational and anti-scientific. I think the sun does rise in the East every morning, and not in the West. Sure, there are things where we don't know what the truth is. We don't know how this virus began, its journey through the human population. I'm not saying that there is a known truth about everything, but I think there is a truth to be found about things. And yes, of course, subjectivity is important, and it's important to see things from people's points of view and so on. But I really think that the Enlightenment point that experiment and observation can lead you to understand things about the world that you cannot get through faith is something we should cling to.
Did you want to come back on that, Sam, or anything?
No, I mean, I think, yeah, I agree with a lot of what you say. I mean, I find myself as well longing for a world where there was more objective truth out there. And I share your belief that in many cases we can get there. But yeah, I mean, who knows? We've got to, I think, yeah, as you're doing a valiant effort, at least in trying to get us to an objective truth as to the origins of this virus.
Thank you.
I've just got a quick question on that point. I mean, what do you think about the role of social media? Because whilst, truth is a casualty, is one of the first casualties of war, I guess this kind of narrative warfare seems to be much easier on the internet and via social media, where we kind of see videos come up. And I think similarly with the pandemic, there was almost like an overwhelming kind of groundswell that happened. And maybe, do you think that has perhaps impacted it, or could that have actually been a benefit? Because then there was lots of discussions that were happening on podcasts and things like that the mainstream legacy media weren't engaging in. So do you think it's been positive or negative for discussion?
Well, I think if you use it carefully, it's positive. You find out within minutes that what Chris Whitty has just said from a podium isn't really the full story, because someone else points out that there's, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pick on Chris Whitty, but do you see what I mean? That there are, the wonderful thing about, I mean, take me personally, I've said things on social media that were wrong, and I've been called on it by someone in minutes, and I've either deleted the tweet or apologized and said, no, I'm terribly sorry, I was, repeating a bit of fake news. Think how hard it is to get away with urban myths these days. There are crocodiles in the sewers of New York because people flush their pets down the toilet, or something. You can look it up so quickly now and point out to someone who says that on Twitter that actually that's an urban myth that's been around for 100 years or something like that. Do you see what I mean? So I like the fact that in this instant social media world, you can check whether someone's telling the truth. But of course, there's a lot of people who are not checking, who are amplifying untruths, and there's a megaphone effect for untruths there and conspiracy theories that is problematic. I'm not convinced it's necessarily that much worse than it was. It's just sort of faster somehow. Mm. And at least a government that's pushing propaganda down my throat it doesn't have the power to stop me thinking, but or getting access to the real information, or rather, we hope it doesn't. It does in China. It doesn't in this country.
Nastasia?
Thanks. Hi, Matt. Thanks for joining today. It's been really interesting so far. I just I wanted to go back to the point, and it links to social media about the decision that there should be sort of a premature consensus prior to sort of like scientific discussion. I read that you were on the select committee on artificial intelligence while you were in the House of Lords, and I wondered if, because I think artificial intelligence has played a role in that. If you're on Twitter or Instagram, there's like automatic pop-ups or even automatic things that don't allow you to kind of follow someone or share an item. And even when I was creating, an advertisement for tonight's event on Canva, there was a thing, as soon as I wrote in COVID-19, it said, read these articles on COVID-19 so that you sort of understand. So I wondered if, while you were in that select committee, if this was a development of artificial intelligence that was foreseen, and if you had any additional thoughts.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. If we told an algorithm, recommend measures for reducing crime, say, it would go out and it would study the data and it would come back and say, easy, lock all men up. They commit much more crime than women. And it would be right, but it's prejudiced. We would say, sorry, we've got to exercise our judgment. And yes, the algorithms have already begun to give us the echo chamber effect and the filter bubble effect that is really problematic. And I'm sure it's why issues get so tremendously polarized these days. I mean, I first noticed it with the Scottish referendum. I hadn't, I thought that there would be a great mushy middle. There wasn't. There was a bunch of people on one side and a bunch of people on the other hating each other. And before that, you didn't get that quite as much. You then got it over Brexit, over Trump, over the pandemic, over this war. You're getting it already. So I do think that artificial intelligence has played a role in polarizing, because it's those algorithms that say, oh, he likes this stuff, we'll give him more of it, that leads you into your echo chamber. And I think that has been a big part of the problem of the last 10 years. And there's evidence that if you put Republicans in front of information that contradicts what they think rather than supports it, and the same with Democrats, they moderate their views. They don't entirely abandon them, but they say, oh yeah, hang on, I do see there's a slightly other angle to that. So I think AI is not really the cause of this, because you can set up some of these algorithms pretty manually, as it were, and it's a pretty basic form of automation that we're talking about there. But I think we do have to tread carefully with respect to that feature of automation. And by the way, it's far more of a concern than the idea that the AI is suddenly going to turn vicious and take over the world and get rid of us because it doesn't like us. The sort of Hal fantasy. I think that's pretty far-fetched compared with the tendency of AI to reinforce our prejudices and things like that. I'm sounding quite Luddite here. That's not my view on the whole.
Nilu?
Thanks. And thanks, Matt. Yeah, my question is, with the conspiracy theories, and I agree with you, some of the conspiracy theories like the 5G network and the chip in your arm, those have been quite laughable. But there were something that were considered conspiracy theories, not really so much in the scientific realm, but more in like the political realm and with restrictions and mandates. And a lot of those, quote unquote conspiracy theories ended up becoming true, whether that was the vaccine passport system or the quarantine camps that were implemented where I live in Canada, as well as in Australia, where I have family. How do we make sense of separating the conspiracy theories that are objectively false versus the conspiracy theories that are subjectively false? And how do we garner trust with the public again if we're scientists during a time that's so uncertain?
Well, this is a question I've wrestled with for 30 years, actually, because it's the question of when to believe the heretic, when to believe the maverick. And I have a soft spot for mavericks. I try and indulge them until I realize that they're saying 2 + 2 = 5, at which point I say, sorry, old chap, I'm not on your side anymore. Whereas most people within science have an immune reaction against any maverick idea. And I think that's a mistake, because I think all great new ideas start out as mavericks. I've never found a really good algorithm or rule of thumb for deciding whether the bloke who bends my ear with a new theory is right or wrong. Obviously, there are some cases where it's not difficult to tell that he's talking nonsense, and other cases where it's fairly easy to find that he's making sense. But in the middle, there's lots of cases where somebody sounds quite convincing, and you haven't got a reason to reject it, but it does turn a lot of physics upside down, so it would require a lot of sensible people to have been wrong. And so you say, well, I don't think that's right, and then it turns out he's right. Or vice versa, you say, look, come on, that can't be true. I'm sorry, I'm just not going to bother to put the time into listening to your wacky conspiracy theory. And then it turns out, well, I can't remember which way around I've got to in that analogy, but you get the point that I just, you have to take each case on its merits. You can't say every time it's a middle-aged man pushing an idea, it's usually wrong. Every time it's a young woman, it's usually right. Or every time they've got letters after their name and they're really well educated, they're probably right. And every time they haven't, they're probably wrong. There's this wonderful little clip of Richard Feynman giving a lecture about physics where he says this. He says, look, if your guess doesn't fit the data, then it's wrong. And it doesn't matter how grand you are, how many letters you have after your name, how many degrees you've got, which institution you're at, you're wrong, right? It's the facts that determine it. And that, obviously for me. So, for example, I talk to a lot of people who tell me a theory about something. And I always say, yes, but how are you going to test it? What's the data that would test your theory? Oh, well, I haven't got that far, but the theory works. And I'm saying, sorry, that's no good. That's like religion. Theory without data is no good. So that's one rule I've got, but that's about it. Otherwise, I just have to use my own judgment. And I don't know when people are right and wrong.
Luke?
Hi, Matt. Firstly, you mentioned the AI solution to crime before, and it actually reminded me of the awful Sarah Everard case, if you remember. And there's actually a Green Party peer that suggested in response to that we curfew all men. So there might actually be people out there. It's not just AIs that think that's a genuine. And obviously, you get all the people online that actually, went up in arms and actually agreed with that theory. But that's not what my question's about anyway. That was just a side note.
Yeah, the peer in question, Jenny Jones, is a good friend of mine. We disagree on almost everything, but we like each other.
Brilliant. Well, that's a sign of a good friendship. My question is maybe following on from Nilu's question there about maybe one of the more out there controversial theories. And I hope I'm not taking the conversation too off piste here. Obviously, the lab leak sort of theory implies, usually when it's talked about, like the accidental nature of it. And I wanted to ask you about the possibility that it might have been intentionally created and released into the population. I'm not usually an overly conspiratorial type of guy. I try to go where the evidence leads me, but I also think it's fun and interesting to play with the ideas, and maybe there's elements of truth within them. And certainly it's not evidence in of itself that it was an intentional leak, but I don't think anyone would disagree that there's a lot of incredibly rich, incredibly powerful people who have very much benefited from the virus and also the world's reaction to it. The media, social media, Amazon, Google, large multinational corporations, pharmaceutical companies, etc. So I understand people trying to connect the dots and come up with these kinds of theories and trying to make it make sense. So clearly we don't know, but I wonder if you have any insight or thoughts on that theory in general.
Alina Chan and I state very clearly in our book that we don't think it was intentional. We think it's very, very, very unlikely that it was. And our reasons for that are fairly straightforward. If you were going to unleash a virus, you wouldn't do it in a city with your top virology lab. You wouldn't do it in a city at all. You'd want to cover your tracks by starting it in somebody else's country or some obscure part of the world. And there's no real evidence that there was anyone who would have obviously been able to benefit from this in terms of having a vaccine ready for their army or in terms of shorting the stocks of companies or whatever it might be. In this case, cock up looks so much more convincing than conspiracy. That said, we do have to recognize that the People's Liberation Army was using these laboratories, among others, to do research because it's interested in biological warfare. But so is the military in my country and in the United States and elsewhere. And in all cases, mostly they're doing it for defensive rather than offensive reasons. They are scared that someone else is going to do this to their army, is going to unleash a bacterium or a virus on their forces. So as I say, there's very little good evidence that to support the idea that anyone did this on purpose. Oh, and the other reason not to do that is because there's the alternative that they were doing what it said on the tin, that they were doing what they said they were doing, which was trying to predict the next pandemic by collecting as many viruses as possible and manipulating them, partly because it was very exciting to do that, and this is a new technology, and partly to make them easier to grow in the laboratory, does seem much more plausible. I really don't think we're dealing with a deliberate bio. Oh, and also the structure of the virus itself doesn't suggest in any way that this is weaponized. It looks so much more like a normal bat SARS-like coronavirus that happens to have acquired a furin cleavage site somewhere along the line and a receptor binding domain that enables it to attack human beings, possibly because it's been in human cells in the laboratory. That partly answers a question I was asked earlier, which I didn't answer, which what is the argument for the lab leak? I'm afraid we're running out of time for that, so you're going to have to go and read the book.
David Palmer?
Yes, just one quick thing first, Matt. I mean, if and when you if it's established the lab leak theory, what do you think that will change, given policy of the West towards China's changing quite a lot anyway? Yeah. Do you remember back to when you were on the select committee meeting in December and Richard Horton was speaking before you? Because I thought I don't know what you thought, what he said, because I thought it was quite extraordinary. Because if you remember, the letter was the statement in support of, and this is the title. If you remember, the title isn't it? Statement in support of the scientists, public health professionals, and medical professionals of China combating COVID-19. It's how extraordinary on the same page he was with with China, really, on the whole issue, because he when he was asked about his role, in that letter, the chair, I think, asked him to talk through how it came about and the discussions on about publishing it. He didn't actually explain anything about his own role in the publishing of the letter. What he did was then justify why the letter was published. Yeah, and I found his two reasons were, firstly, I'll just read out what he said. Firstly, the political context. In that period, in late January through early February, there was growing criticism of China, particularly in the United States. Tom Cotton, a Republican, for example, called China duplicitous and dishonest in its response to the pandemic, and that there were that these initial claims about the possibility of an escape from the virus from the Wuhan Institute. So his very reasons for publishing it were very politicized from the very beginning. Yeah, he's basically he's saying, look, these Republicans, they're criticizing China over this potential lab leak, and I'm going to come to China's defense. Yeah, the second reason was, of course, you can only call it the woke reason, which was the second part was a more public context when that there was growing anti-Asian sentiment. And then he made sort of unsubstantiated claims about Chinese anti-Asian abuse on Twitter, etc.
Yeah. Well, just what would it change if we did find out? I don't really know the answer to that question. It's somewhat above my pay grade. There's a lot of reasons to be very wary of the current Chinese regime at the moment. Anyway, with respect to Hong Kong and the Uyghurs, this would be one more reason. I don't think that the world will suddenly say, you owe us reparations or anything, but I think it might say, please, please sign a pandemic treaty and agree to be more transparent in the future. And that's what I think we should be doing in the West, is negotiating a treaty about how to treat these kinds of outbreaks the way we treat airline accidents, share the information as widely as possible. And if we all sign such a treaty, then China might eventually be shamed into signing it too and living by its precepts. On the Richard Horton evidence to that Commons Science and Technology Committee, he was rather put on the spot. He's the editor of The Lancet, over the fact that he had allowed Peter Daszak to orchestrate that statement, the one you read out bits of, without declaring a conflict of interest, even though he'd been working very closely with the Wuhan Institute of Virology for many years. It took him 18 months to print that conflict of interest statement. And when asked why, he said, because it takes a long time to persuade someone like Peter Daszak to allow you to print that. Well, I thought you were the editor, and he said, but I realized immediately it needed to be done. So I then pointed out that, well, you may have realized that, but you actually appointed Peter Daszak to a commission to look into the origin after that you said it needed to be done. So I don't think the editor of The Lancet has been very fair about this issue, and he has published editorials in the past saying how much he admires the Chinese government and Xi Jinping in particular. This isn't the way I would expect a medical journal like The Lancet to behave.
Just one other quick thing on that. You're very aware of the 1930s geneticist Haldane, who was a big supporter of the Soviet Union, and he's a big eugenicist, wasn't he? Right? I agree very much with your point earlier on. Is we've probably had a period, in the post-war period, a golden age of openness. Yeah. Do you think we to some degree we're going back to more to an earlier era when these things could be highly politicized?
Possibly. Haldane, as you know, excused Lysenko.
Yeah.
For far too long. He did eventually realize that he couldn't go on doing so, but because the guy was Lysenko was an appalling persecutor of people who opposed his pseudoscience, and JBS Haldane made excuses for him. I hope we don't get back to that. Anyway, I'll move on. Thanks.
Yeah, we've got 25 minutes left, so please, if you have more questions, please raise your hand. Sorry? Oh, I thought someone jumped in. We'll go to Hilary.
Oh, hi. We started this meeting at 7 o'clock, and literally just before, between 5 and 7, I listened to the Vice-Chancellor's lecture at the University of Cambridge, and he was in conversation with Tedros Ghebreyesus.
Oh.
And he was full of admiration for this gentleman. And others of the great and the good were assembled, like the former head of Oxfam, on whose watch all the scandals happened. And they demonstrated everything that you talked about at the beginning: herd mentality, a patronizing view of the public, a top-down view, we never do anything wrong. They talked about moral virtue, and they seemed to all agree that they were all morally virtuous and other people needed to be the same. And it seemed to me it was social stroking among a lot of highly paid individuals. And when the Vice-Chancellor closed the meeting, he said, well, this had been a challenging, evidence-based discussion. I've never heard anything less challenging or less evidence-based in all my life. I think part of it is because Cambridge University has seemed to sold its soul to a great degree in order to be China's useful idiot. It runs through the colleges, it runs through the departments. It's lonely in Cambridge, and I'm so glad we've got you. I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you, Hilary. And I don't think I'm much use to you, and I, for some reason, didn't get an invitation to that particular lecture.
Yeah.
Wonder why. Yeah. I mean, it's important not to personalize these things too much. I don't want to get into a situation where it's all Tedros's fault. But there is no doubt in anybody's mind that he was China's candidate for that job. China essentially went round Africa saying, vote for this guy and we'll make sure we get you a loan for your new airport. That I put it a little more bluntly than they did, but that's roughly what happened. And one of the things he did in 2019 was he approved traditional Chinese medicine as a legitimate form of medicine. That's sort of okay for some parts of traditional Chinese medicine, but it's not great for others. The eating of pangolin scales, which leads to the pangolin being the most smuggled and most endangered mammal, is equivalent to eating your fingernails. It's, they're made of keratin. They do not improve your fertility or anything else. And it feels to me like there was a bowing to pseudoscience for political reasons going on just with that decision alone. When the WHO met at the end of January 2020 and discussed whether to declare a health emergency, an international health emergency, they bowed to Chinese requests not to. And when a few weeks later they reversed their decision, China was the only country voting against. So there is no doubt that, and just another example, so as not to personalize it to Tedros, one of the very senior World Health Organization officials was interviewed by a journalist around this time. And the journalist said, what about the Taiwanese? What they said? And he said, oh dear, the internet seems to be not working. I didn't hear your question. So she repeated the question. So click. He went offline. She called him up again and he came back online and she said, you appear not to have heard the question, and then there seems to be some strange break in the conversation. I was asking you what you thought about what the Taiwanese said the other day. And he said, well, I think we've talked about China enough. Let's move on to another question. Now, why would he do that? Because if you are a WHO official, you are not supposed formally to recognize that Taiwan exists, let alone is allowed to have a view. And the Taiwanese were the first people to alert the world and the World Health Organization to this pandemic. They said, we are picking up reports from hospitals in Wuhan that there is a infectious pneumonia of unexplained origin spreading. And I just think that, you know, Britain gives as much money to the World Health Organization as Taiwan does, but we never tell it what to do. Perhaps we should sometimes. Perhaps we should occasionally flex our muscles and say, look, vaping is good for you because it gets you off cigarettes. How dare you campaign against vaping? That's another issue which I feel strongly about. But my faith in institutions in this world has been going downhill for some time, frankly, and it's pretty low now.
Harvey, just more. Oh,
Sorry.
Go for it.
Well, it wasn't just Tedros, it's great and the good of Cambridge University.
Mm.
That's it, sorry.
That's fine.
Well, thank you, Hilary.
Harvin Moore.
Thank you very much. It's quite an honor to speak to you, Mr. Ridley. I've read, I think, all of your books, and I've always enjoyed them. This question is a little general, and it kind of brings perhaps the discussion back to a theme that I remember from the first book I read. I think it was Rational Optimist, and it just concerns your optimism. And I guess what I'm wondering is what seems to me to be a differential between the susceptibility. This may be wrong, but at least it's my hope that I'm right. There seems to be a difference in susceptibility to believing whatever you want to call it, false information or propaganda or whatever it may be, between older people and younger people. So we see this in COVID. A lot of us have parents or grandparents who we know people of all ages, but seem more susceptible to believe what they hear, let's say, on Fox News. And as I look over into Ukraine and particularly Russia, it seems as if the younger people who are more connected to social media and sources of news around the world are less likely to believe what Putin tells them. So are you optimistic?
I am still generally a rational optimist. Every year since I wrote that book 10, 12 years ago, people would say to me, you can't possibly still be a rational optimist. Look at what's happening in Syria or whatever. And there always seemed to be some reason why people would think I should have abandoned any optimism about the future. And I would always say, well, yeah, but look at what's happening in Africa. There's been tremendous economic growth. There's been an incredible decline in malaria. There are much bigger trends happening in the world which aren't being reported. And the bad news that dominates the news is being reported. And that's giving you a false sense of how the world's getting worse. I have my moments now of real worry that we might be entering a dark age of anti-enlightenment. And a lot of it comes from the culture war. The combination of bureaucracy and superstition is what usually brings civilizations to an end. The Ming bureaucracy in China created great impoverishment. The spread of evangelical Christian superstition at the end of the Roman Empire was, I think, a terrible thing. That may not be everyone else's point of view, but that's one of the things I think. I don't think we can guarantee that all is going well. I'm interested in your observation that the young are less susceptible to nonsense than the old. I think I agree with that. But I'm aware of quite a lot of old people who roll their eyes and say, well, I've heard all that kind of stuff before. And, one of the ways I start talks when I talk about optimism is by saying, look, I was young in the 1970s. And in that era, there was nothing optimistic being told to us young people at all. We were told that, the population explosion was unstoppable, famine was inevitable, pollution was getting worse, nuclear war was around the corner, an ice age was coming. We weren't told anything positive about the future, just as you're not being told anything positive about the future now. And therefore, I urge you to take with a pinch of salt some of the particularly environmental pessimism that you are being force-fed through the television and also through your education system. So I hope the young are cynical about some of the stuff, but I'm not convinced they always are.
Well, Free Speech Champions is a group for young people that want to expand the boundaries of free speech. So we hope that we're doing our bit to
I think you are.
Engage young people. Isabel?
Thank you. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Isabel. Nice to see you.
Hi. Yeah, nice to see you. Hi from Chile.
Are you in Chile at the moment?
Yeah, I am in Chile, and I'm looking forward to seeing you soon in the UK. I have a question about science and women, which I hope it's not too off topic. But basically, I've been asked in the context of March the 8th to talk in different instances about the role of science, of women in science and education largely. And I'm finding it very difficult because, of course, I don't buy the general assumption that it's all about discrimination, given that I think we do see very real gender differences, and when women are given free choice, there are differences. But still the question is valid, like how to encourage more and better participation of women in science and education. I mean, if it is a valid question, I'm finding it really difficult to think about this for some reason. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, well, the rest of the audience should know that this is an incredibly courageous and brilliant woman who spent many months in the Congolese jungle studying bonobos and doing really good research. And so is a very fine woman scientist, but with a lot more courage than most men I know. You alluded to something there, which is that when you give women free choice of careers, they don't necessarily choose the same things as men on average. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of overlap, but and that's an interesting feature. I've seen data which suggests that more women go into STEM subjects in countries like Iran and Turkey than in Western European countries. At university, that is. Why? Because they basically have to do what their dads tell them to do in those countries. And their dads want them to become mathematicians and engineers, which is a sort of slightly odd and ironic thing. And yes, lots of women do become great maths and physics people in the West too, but there's more of them piling into medicine and than there are, than men, well, not quite, yes, more than men and fewer than men in piling into the harder science subjects. So that's a really interesting little sort of quirk, that on the one hand, those Muslim countries are actually ending up with more female engineers, but for sort of slightly perverse reasons. And somewhere there's a very interesting idea to explore. Do women bring a different touch to science? Well, you remember Louis Leakey deliberately chose female primatologists. You know this, because you are one. You're not one that Louis Leakey chose, but he deliberately chose, Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and Biruta Gildekas to study the great apes, because he knew they would do long-term studies. He knew they wouldn't give up after 3 years and go and study something else. Their attention span was sufficient that they would do a decade or more of work. You know, that again is a sort of slightly sexist view. You know, that they're different. They can do something different. They're going to stick to the task more. Which is wrong because there's huge overlap. And, you know, I'm sure some women have very short attention spans and some men have quite long attention spans. I think it's a mistake to deny that there's going to be any consistent differences between the sexes in the way they approach science at all. But those are going to be quite interesting and curious differences that are very hopefully complementary. You know, you get, hopefully you get a man with a short attention span and a woman with a long attention span, and you get a good result out of them working together. So that's my perhaps slightly too even-handed answer to your very good question.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
And by the way, as you probably know, I am married to a particularly talented scientist myself who happens to be female. So
yes, I know that's part of, yeah, that's also why I'm asking. And yeah, I think the point of Iran and engineers is really interesting because it'd be a kind of a twist on the patriarchy argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Isabel. We have about 8 minutes left, so short, sharp questions and answers for the last few questions. John Lobel, please.
Hi, thank you for all your great books, which I've read and enjoyed. Do you feel that the information that we are getting about the effectiveness of the vaccines and their side effects and injuries is adequate information?
It's a really good question. I have to say, I'm really worried about the impact of this pandemic on the acceptability of vaccines going forward, because I think vaccines are probably one of the most life-saving technologies ever invented. You know, getting rid of smallpox and polio and measles and all these other things was an incredible benefit to mankind. And it's a wonderful story. Started incidentally by a woman, lady, at least in Europe, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, getting the idea from the Turkish harem and bringing it back to Britain and then Europe in the early 1700s. I think vaccines are wonderful, but I think in our desperation to make people accept them, we sometimes risk over-claiming for them. Obviously, you know, in some cases like the smallpox vaccine, they just work and it's fantastic. But in cases like this COVID pandemic, the first results were fantastic. It looked very promising. And I remember talking to the head of the British program, Kate Bingham, who's an old friend, and she said, well, yeah, the results are good, but we don't yet know if it prevents transmission. And I said, well, if it stops you getting the disease, it must prevent transmission, doesn't it? I mean, you know, stands to reason. And she said, well, not necessarily. And I thought, oh, Kate, you're worrying too much. But she was absolutely right. We ended up with vaccines that do very little to prevent transmission, at least with these later variants, with Delta and Omicron. And I don't think we prepared the public for that well enough. I mean, I remember being on a conference call with the British health minister at the time, was Nadeem Zahawi, and saying, in your zeal to make sure that people take up the vaccine and to combat the ridiculous anti-vaxxers, you mustn't say this is 100% safe or 100% effective, because it's not. It's the lesser of two evils. It's a harm reduction strategy, like vaping. You know, vaccination carries a risk. It's a very, very small risk compared with the risk of dying of COVID, at least for middle-aged and older people. But it's not a zero risk. And if you tell people that, and then they find out that actually there are the odd person who's getting quite serious complications, then it might backfire on you. So I fear we've mishandled it. And I tell you, the bit that really irritates me most is the vaccine passport scheme, because it was originally brought in with the idea that because vaccines prevent transmission, we therefore are going to use vaccine passports to try and stop the virus spreading. Well, when it became clear that the vaccine did very little to stop transmission, it just stopped serious disease, the justification for vaccine passports evaporated overnight, but the government didn't give up on them. And even in Britain, you know, it was insistent on, even in England, I should say, in Scotland, it became absolutely essential. Why? Because we want to push people into having the vaccine. Well, that's a different reason and not such a good one. And are you sure it won't backfire? And aren't you just feeding people's paranoia about the power of government? You know, and I'm a libertarian. I don't like the idea of your papers, please. I'm a pro-vaccine libertarian, but you're putting me in a difficult position by bringing in vaccine passports. So that was my rather tortured response to that. Sorry, that was too long a response.
We'll take the last two questions together. So firstly, David, and then Dylan, and then final thoughts from you, Matt. So David.
Hi, Matt. Great to see you.
David, great to see you.
I've been kind of horrified, I guess, by the recent Carl Zimmer front page New York Times thing on Warbury's additional work on the market theory. And thanks for you and Alina for being so tenacious about trying to stick to the facts. But I can't remember a time when a couple of preprints made the front page of the New York Times. But what's going on? You have any insight into?
Yeah.
Thank you. And Dylan, as the last question.
Okay, yeah. So I wouldn't want to necessarily end on a grim note, but you describe yourself as a rational optimist, so maybe you can spin it for us. You mentioned that you are a little bit uncertain about the way that our institutions in the West are sort of degrading. And I guess I want to ask you, like, where do you see this leading? And how can we, I know this is a big question, but how can we establish something like a unified sense of authority or like concrete responses rather than just uncertainty and a lot of argument?
Yeah, well, to take that first, there is no utopia, there is no nirvana. We're not suddenly going to declare kumbaya and everyone will be reasonable and rational and we can plow on ahead. We live in a world of uncertainty. We live in a world where you don't know what the right answer is half the time, and we live in a world of irrationalism. But we always have. And I think you need to take some comfort from looking back at the last few centuries when all sorts of people were madly irrational, horribly political, grossly violent, and yet incredible improvements in human living standards were achieved by science and technology and other things. Turning to David's excellent question quickly, I don't know if others have followed it, but the front page story in the New York Times this week, based on a long preprint that's appeared saying, actually, it definitely started in the market. There's incontrovertible proof, and dispositive evidence is the phrase is used in the paper. No such thing. It's the new data, which they've analyzed to death, does seem to show that it's possible, but not certain, that there was a bit of a concentration within that wet market in one corner of it, which is where we now know that animals were for sale, which we've known for many months. And we know that they probably didn't test all the animals in the markets. So there were 4 preprints came out this week. 2 of them said we definitely don't think it started in the market. And 2 of them said, we definitely do think it did. The New York Times only talked about the latter 2. There was no smoking gun. There was no infected animal. The least we need from the market hypothesis is an infected animal, an animal carrying this virus. Now, either the Chinese have got that and they won't tell us, which is a conspiracy theory, or they haven't, and there may not have been one, or they missed it, or something like that. But this is an attempt to shut down the debate and to get it back on track to where it was at the beginning of 2020, when many of the co-authors of this latest preprint could say with certainty, we can rule out a lab leak. You can't rule out a lab leak without investigating a lab leak. That's the basic truth. I think you'd agree with that, David, wouldn't you? And so we have to just hope that we get through the next couple of weeks without the entire world mainstream media saying, oh, I gather it's solved, which is the intention of this. I think they've had some pretty expensive PR consultants, actually, by the look of it. But we need more people like you, David, to come out and say, no, it's not solved. We need a proper debate. Anyway, your support and help and advice has been useful throughout this.
Well, thank you so much, Matt Ridley. It's been so fantastic hearing your thoughts. It's really been amazing to have you as part of this discussion. And thank you so much for your insight and contribution and expanding the boundaries of knowledge and understanding on this really, really important issue today, but also just in general. And thank you everybody for attending. This is the end of the Origins of COVID-19 Science, Skepticism and Free Speech event. And as I said, Free Speech Champions is a group of young people trying to argue for why free speech and open inquiry is important and make the case for it in the present day. So please
thank you for everything you do, Inaya. It's great work.
Thank you. Please share around Free Speech Champions and find ways in which you can get involved. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you again, Matt, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their evening. Thank you.